All right, welcome back to another day, another session in our intro to biblical Hebrew. Our topic today is more or less dealing with syntax, something we've touched on very briefly before, but now we're going to look at, and we'll start doing this a bit more frequently now that we have a few verbs under our belt. But it's a light one today. We're going to meet one new small word that doesn't translate at all, but is more or less a signpost in a verbal sentence. To help us differentiate between subjects and objects, and that is our sign of the accusative or our direct object marker. We'll also revisit the concept of word order and throw one new element into the mix. We'll look at, again, another small word, a negative particle, the word for not or no, and then we'll look at syntax to see how Hebrew sentences form negations and things we want to know about subject-verb agreement to translate things well. So again, a relatively light one for today, but hopefully by lightening things here, that gives us a chance to look over our CalPerfect verbs again and really build into that foundation. So why don't we think about a few other items that relate to a Hebrew verbal sentence? All right, here is our word that we're going to be dealing with, et or et. Now, most often in English, and to some extent in Hebrew, as we'll see in a minute, we use word order to indicate what or who is the subject of a verb and what or who is receiving the action. And the term we use for that is the direct object. So if it's been a while since you've studied up on your English grammar, this is one word or one concept we want to revisit. The direct object in a sentence is the item, the entity or the person, whatever it is, that receives the action of a verb. So if we take an example in English, and if I was to say, I hit the ball, our object is the ball. We don't have a signal in that sentence in English to tell us that, but we just know it because we're paying attention to the word order. Subject, verb, object. We know how to identify those things in an English sentence. Most often in Hebrew, phrases and sentences will fall in line with a common word order that we'll talk about in our next slide. But when it comes to this one item of identifying the direct object, we also have another hint that we can pay attention to. And this is where we get into this form here, et or et. Two variations of spelling on the same item. In Hebrew, this word or this form is a special form that's used to explicitly indicate which word in a phrase or sentence is the direct object. So this form doesn't translate it as anything at all. It's a syntactical signpost clarifying which word in the sentence is a direct object. Now the caveat of that that I want to emphasize is that this indicates direct objects that are definite. So objects that are a proper name or a person or something that has the definite article or something that has a demonstrative alongside of it. So this form we will see is only pointing to direct objects, definite direct objects. For indefinite objects, then we have to rely on word order and context. That's what this form is about. This form is, again, a signpost. It's not translated. And that's how it functions in a sentence. Now, we have an example of a sentence down here that we've read, I guess, many weeks ago at this point, our very first class, I believe, where we see this show up. In fact, we see it show up a few times. And the reason why we see it show up a few times is it's possible in Hebrew and in English to have a sentence that has more than one object. Our English example from before, I could say, I hit the ball and the bat or something if you were playing baseball, and there you'd have two direct and indirect object. Well, in Hebrew, you can have the same thing, and in such cases, you might have the direct object marker duplicated in a compound sentence. So let's look at this sentence here and read it and see if we can see what's going on. Bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. All right, if you crack open your Hebrew Bible, this is going to be the first thing that you read, more or less. I've simplified the sentence for us, but what this is saying here, again, to jog our memories, God created. He created what? Hashemayim, the heavens, and the haaretz. What we're not translating are these two forms. This is our word for creation, this is our word for God, this is the heavens, this is the earth. But these two items right here don't have a translation value. They're our marker of the accusative or our direct object, definite direct object marker. They're telling us that, well, God is the subject, that's our verb, bara. What did he create? Et hashemayim, the et haaretz. So what we need to pay attention to there is, so far, the principle we've been operating with is that we translate everything in a sentence. Now we're going to get something here where we don't translate it, but it's super helpful for understanding how we understand the other words in the sentence. And that gets us into this issue of syntax, where we'll finish off today. All right, why don't we jot down a few notes on syntax of Hebrew sentences? Since now we have a verb at least under our belt, or almost under our belt, and we've started to ask questions about this issue of syntax on our last slide with that discussion of the accusative or sign of the or definite direct object marker. Now, we've come across the issue of word order a few times in our exercises, and more recently, now that we are dealing with verbs in the Hebrew sentence. The typical pattern for word order is verb, subject, object. And I like to remember that as just VSO. Verb, subject, object, VSO. Remember that, and that'll be that typical pattern. Now, it's possible that that's not going to be the pattern, where that is rearranged. Either the subject is fronted or the verb is put late, for example. And that's almost always done for emphasis. So when you see a reconfiguration of that VSO pattern, pay attention to that. Maybe the writer is trying to tell you something about the syntax and the emphasis they're placing on a certain item, either the verb or the subject. But most of the time we'll see VSO, so let's make that our operating principle. A few things that we could remind ourselves of that we perhaps didn't emphasize as much in our treatment of Hebrew verbs, those cal-perfect verbs, is that in a sentence, verbs must agree with their subject. They must fully agree with their subject in person, gender, and number. So let's look at a few examples, and here we'll look at our first example to illustrate this. Shamar Moshe et HaTorah. Shamar Moshe et HaTorah. So if we wanted to walk through this, we would see here we have our verb, shamar, to keep, Moshe, Moses. Et, we just learned, is going to be marking our definite direct object, and here it's it's the Torah, HaTorah. So to translate that, we would say Moses observed or kept what? The Torah. The point to recognize here is that there needs to be full agreement between this noun, Moses, and this verb, to keep. If we were to parse this verb, that would be a cal-perfect verb. It would be a third masculine singular verb, and we can tell that by this pointing and by the fact that there's no ending on the end of the verb. It's 3ms. Therefore, its subject must be a masculine singular verb, and Moshe is a masculine singular verb. This is so helpful when it comes to translating sentences, as we have other nouns floating around or adjectives that even look like nouns perhaps. Look for agreement between your noun and your subject, and that will give you an anchor for translating the rest of the sentence. So that's the first lesson to learn here. Agreement in person, gender, and number between your nouns and your verbs. Now let's take an iteration of that example of Shamar Moshe et HaTorah and take the noun out of it. Because in Hebrew, it's possible to have a full, complete sentence without an explicit subject. And the reason why, if you remember from our nouns, or from our verb paradigm rather, because verbs are inflected for person, gender, and number, built into them is a pronoun in a sense. A 3ms verb would translate as he kept in this case. Or if it was a 3fs, it would be she kept, all the way down, you, I, they. There's all of these pronouns that are built into those verbs that imply a subject. So this example, Shamar et HaTorah, we would translate as he kept the Torah. Again, we would need to then look in the context. Is there a referent earlier in the sentence or earlier in the narrative? Is it still talking about Moses, or is it somebody else? But the important thing for us here in this kind of snippet example is to remind ourselves that yes, in cases like this, we are looking for agreement, but when a subject is not stated in cases like this, we need to look to the verb and parse it properly so that we include the right pronoun in our translation. In this case, a third masculine verb would be he kept et haTorah, the Torah. So that's our second item on our list up top. Now our final one has to do with negations and negative particles. So how do you frame something in Hebrew that says no or not? There's going to be a few ways that we'll see this when we dig deeper into our verbal system, but in the Cal Perfect, we are going to see one form in particular, and it's this form here, lo. That form lo can be written defectively there with a holum. You may also see it like this, where we have that holum vav here, so don't be thrown if you see that. What this does is it comes in before the verb, and it frames a sentence as a negation. Lo shamar et haTorah. So building on our previous example, shamar et haTorah, he kept the Torah, the instruction, the law. Now if we have lo in front of that, that's saying the opposite. It's saying he did not keep haTorah, the law, the instruction, the Torah, whatever the context may be. In your translation, you're going to need to take these two things together to make sure that you have that negative, that negation, that nuance included. Otherwise, you'd be saying something very different. So that's a few notes on syntax. Again, a light one today, really focusing on those items that are going to signal something important for us in the syntax, like et or et. That's going to tell us this is the definite direct object. Make sure you translate it accordingly. Also paying attention to things in syntax about subject-verb agreement, or when there is no subject, how to understand a verb as giving you the clue to recovering that implied subject. Or lastly, make sure that you're translating things with that negative particle. You're going to want to make sure it says lo shamar et haTorah. You're not translating that in a positive sense because that would convey the opposite. So again, syntax, we're going to start dealing with this more and more, and this is a way of using clues in the sentence to guide you in translation rather than just translating the way you think it should sound. Pay attention to the words on the page and the items in a sentence, and you'll arrive at a translation that reflects the meaning and the intent of the text.